Okay, in this picture I'm going to split things into thirds. It's a way of having an interesting subject, but without plonking it right in the middle of the frame. It balances it off. We're lucky here that we have an interesting thing on the left, the tree, and an interesting thing on the right, the fence. Here are my three frames. They're identical compositions but different exposures. The reason for that is the camera will have given me an exposure possibly around this top one here. It's metering off these darker areas, but there's the risk that this stuff here in the background will be extremely bright. Then I went darker and darker still. Let's just click on the first one and see how the camera did do. So if I do Command U, which is auto exposure in Lightroom, that's not bad, but it has lost some of the highlight detail in the background on the field. So let's go to our next frame and similar, Command U. That seems like a good compromise. We've still got highlight detail, the shadows aren't too dark yet. So the thirds here are in effect that there's a split, even though the tree is kind of nearly halfway across the frame, there is a split into three. It's kind of a line down the middle of the tree and this vertical line through here. So we've got field, near us, and left of the tree. So it's roughly thirds, not precisely. D for develop and check out the white balance. I'm going to put it on daylight as a good start, see how it looks. Nice. I do like the sense of light coming across here, underneath the tree and over the top of the field. So I've got this kind of patch of light here. So when I'm using the brushes, I'm going to be careful I don't lose this sense of sideways lighting coming in here. There's not a great deal needs doing to this. I'm going to lift up these grassier areas in tone, so K with the brushes. About a stop extra. Again, I don't want to go too bright. If I overdo the lightness in these shadowy areas, we'll lose this sense of the light coming sideways, hitting the tree. So I'm just picking these up a little bit. And maybe the back of the tree. And a little bit under the branches here. So just so you can see the area where I've done this. So this was before, and I'm brightening it a little like this. I'm going to pull down the black tones to increase the contrast in those areas and lift up the highlights. I'm going to vignette the whole picture. It doesn't feel like it's quite straight to me. I'm just going to press R for rotate, and I'm going to click outside the cropping box and check. It feels to me like the whole thing is slightly turning downhill. Yep, that feels more stable. May increase the clarity a little bit. Now, there's one or two things distracting me. I think it's a little bright here in this area, and I wouldn't mind this edge here being darker, which will then make the highlight on the tree more apparent. When you've got a darker area behind something and a lighter area in front, it increases the sort of the sense of the 3D nature of it. This is something I learned from drawing as a young art student. So it works quite well on the picture here. You can see that even though the grass on this side and this side of the tree are pretty much tonally similar, it looks lighter here against the dark of the tree, and it looks darker here against the light of the tree. And if you emphasize that, it gives you a stronger feeling of the 3D nature of the tree in the foreground. So using a new small brush, I'm just going to darken this edge here. I'm going to use the same brush to darken around here, away from the tree. And then using another brush, I'm going to lighten up the area against the shadow side of the tree. So again, just about half a stop. There we go. So we have this kind of progression from light to dark to light to dark, which just gives it a little bit more kind of 3D quality. This is a good example of a shot where you have something which is symmetrical. So either side is the same, and I'm shooting straight down the middle. The only variation is above the horizon line where the trees are sticking up on one side. I'm having to expose for the sky really. It's got the sun in it and it's very bright, and the last thing we want is that to be completely blown out and white. So I'm going to take a range of shots with the sky getting darker and darker, and I'll have to pull up the bottom area, the symmetrical fences and the path in post-production. So here it is composed. I'm going to focus to around about here, this area here. I'm hoping that everything will be sharp right to the foreground, and the background should be reasonably sharp. I'm shooting at f9, so that has quite a good depth of field on a 24mm lens, so quite wide zoom. Depth of field should be okay. The base exposure is a 25th of a second, but I'm going to do them shorter and shorter to get the sky nice and dark. Here are the 4 shots, different exposures, all zeroed in Lightroom. As you can see, only one of them really has any detail in the sky. So with the auto settings done in Lightroom, it does its best to try and pull back the sky, but it's clearly gone in this one. Partially gone in that, nearly gone in that. This is the only one with proper detail in the sky, so that's going to be our shot, I think, to process. Into the develop module. I do have some dust on the sensor, the kind of which the retouching tool in this is designed for. It's right up at the very top here. And I noticed it in a couple of the other frames, but it was sufficiently far away to not matter. Looks a bit odd here. So I'm just going to press Q and use a smallish brush, and I click on my dust spot. The software then chooses where it clones from, and as long as you don't get it on somewhere completely different like this, it'll do fine. It'll do a pretty good job. It's more looking for texture, which it then matches. So this looks kind of okay, and obviously it's very dark down the bottom. We've exposed for the sky only. This is a good camera. I've shot at 100 ISO. My exposure was a 200th of a second at f9. It's on a tripod, it's nice and clear and sharp, so the shadows should be pretty good. And so I'm going to have to use brushes, great big soft brushes with lots of additional exposure, and I really crank it. I'll give it 3 stops so you can see where we are. There we go. Obviously far too much, but it gives a sense of where it is. I'm not going right to the edges. I'm taking the opportunity to add in a little bit of edge darkness using this brush, and then manually adjust it using the slider till it feels about right, which I would say is around about there. And perhaps some clarity, give it a bit more punch in the highlights. That looks fine. I could use another brush to try and brighten up just the shadow areas of the trees. So I'm using the slider. I'll put it on 100 plus shadows, decrease the brush size, just see if we can get the trees up without affecting the sky too badly. That's fine, and maybe this bit down the front could be brighter. We've got a leading line here, despite it being a symmetrical subject. It just occurs to me that it might be interesting to shoot this from lower down so the fence is against the sky rather than against the fields behind. So I'm choosing a pretty dark exposure of the sky, and I've moved the camera left a bit. I'm going to shoot that and then move it right and stitch the 2 together in Lightroom. This is the left-hand frame. This is the right-hand frame. And my regular tip for doing this, the previous 2 shots shot at the same time, same exposure, designed to be stitched together. So I'm going to hold up 2 fingers in front and photograph those as a reminder when I'm going through my shots that's what they're there for, those 2 previous shots. Here are my stitched frames of the same subject with the camera dropped lower. Frame 1, frame 2, and my reminder, the 2 fingers, back to G for grid, highlight the 2 frames that belong together, the before my shot. Right click, although this is also available in the menus, and photo merge panorama. Now, as long as these 2 pictures were shot at the same time with a decent overlap and the same exposure, they'll stitch together very successfully. There's various different options about how you can do this, which is a whole other subject which you should look up, or I'll do a tutorial on it at some point. I find for wide-angle shots like this, generally cylindrical works best for me. Frequently boundary warp will stretch the edges to fill the frame, and sometimes I use it right up to 100%. We're getting a slight curve on one of the posts here. I'll back it off a little bit and click auto crop. That means it's going to remove any white edges. It does have the option to automatically fill the edges with artificially generated detail, but I'm slightly suspicious of that and worried I'm going to leave some behind and it look unnatural, so I tend to not use it. Then click merge. Lightroom will allow you to carry on working. It's good at backgrounding tasks like this, but we will cut here and come back to it when it's ready. Here's our panorama finished. Usually I need to crop a little bit because I tend to overshoot either end, so we've got lots of space when stitching together. It's too much on the left. Round about here. I'm going to use a brush to brighten up the foreground. Just round here. Then I'm going to use a graduated filter to darken the sky. Perhaps I've overdone the crop. Luckily, Lightroom non-destructive cropping allows you to go back in, redo them. I wonder if there's any detail left in the highlights. A little bit. Oh, in fact, quite a lot. I often find that auto exposure in Lightroom will tend to blow out clouds and highlights, which are actually still there. And the key to getting them back is not just highlight reduction, which is a familiar concept, but actually reducing the whites. That seems to get areas of extreme brightness that have perhaps overexposed back, but at the expense of the rest of the image darkening a little, which you then have to restore using brushes elsewhere. So just to show you again, so even with my maximum highlight reduction, it's only pulling back a certain amount of those brighter clouds, but with the white down, there we go, you see, getting detail right into the brightest areas here. But I will need to use brushes to put back some whiteness, which just tends to brighten the whole thing up a bit. There we are. So that's a much more forgiving, softer kind of graduation in the highlights in the sky. So you can see just how far this has come from our basic raw shot, even auto-developed, to that. This is another good example of a leading lines shot. As the sun's going down on my left, we're getting some quite nice patches of light working their way through the trees. And down at the front, there's a footpath leading up the track. The temptation is to put this in the center of the frame, but I'm not going to. You see, sometimes you may be inclined to put it just here. And while that's fine, I think it'd make a more interesting picture if we stick it over to the right a bit and try to get some of that fence on the left. So we're dividing this kind of into thirds. This is a thirds picture as well as the leading line. I'm on ISO 100, f9, a 50th of a second, round about 24mm on the zoom of the lens. That should give us a reasonable depth of field. I'm focused on the grass near the front of the frame, here. I'm having to be quite cautious about my exposure. The sky is very bright and the tree is heavily backlit, but I really don't want the sky to overexpose. So I'm erring on the side of caution, actually underexposing a little bit. In Lightroom, I'm going to Command U, Auto Expose, and put the white balance on daylight, nice and warm. Now, very bright in the top left. Again, I'm going to try and pull down the whites to recover, and the highlights to recover some detail up there. Everything else has gone rather dark, so I lift up the shadows. Add in a little vignette. And I'm going to increase the contrast. I like these areas of light, dark, light, dark, light. I'm going to try and emphasize that. I'm also going to darken the top left using a graduated filter. You can see I think I've overexposed this shot. It is so bright in the top left. And on darkening, it's showing up that the picture's become almost monochrome in the real highlight area where it's burnt out. So I'm going to adjust the temperature balance to blue, which will mask that somewhat. It looks a bit more like natural sky. Then K for brushes, I'm going to pull up some of my shadowy areas in the tree here. And then another brush, I'm going to darken a few of these areas so I get this light dark pattern I was talking about. So darken down here, darken across the back of that, and maybe darken this side as well. I don't particularly like what's happening at the top of the frame, so I'm going to bring that down. Increase the overall brightness. Add a bit more contrast still. Perhaps cool the picture slightly. That's looking pretty good. I've now moved around to take pretty much a reverse view of the last shot. It's sort of a similar composition with the path running up the bottom of the frame. I'm shooting this on a wider lens. I'm on my 16mm lens, again focused around here towards the front. 15th of a second at f10 this time. The additional shafts of light coming across the frame are very useful for describing the space. So we've got a dark area, then light, then dark, then light as we go through the picture. The purpose of these shots is to show you some basic structural elements that you can use in your compositions, which are generally good starting points and will allow you to see things perhaps more clearly in a situation that you're unfamiliar with, where you're looking for shapes, structure. This one is divided roughly into quarters with a leading line up from the bottom. Here's my chosen frame. If I do Command U for auto, that's quite nice. I go into develop and have a little look at this. Daylight white balance, that looks quite nice. I may warm it a little bit, and a little bit of red. We're getting a lot of those red frequencies in the sunlight as it starts to go down and the sun filters through the atmosphere at lower levels. Again, similarly to the last shot, I have areas of light, of dark, light, light, dark, kind of, and then a darker area. So we've got this kind of stripes of pattern running across it, as well as this cross shape in the center and this diagonal line in from the bottom. So it's a kind of quite a nice sort of rigid, fairly rigid composition. I'm going to try cropping it. Just going to come in at the corner a little bit. Again, I'm referring to my little thumbnail in the corner. It seems to make it easier to judge. So each time I let go of the picture as I'm moving it around, I'm checking it in the corner there. That's looking good. As ever, Lightroom does a pretty good job with auto exposure, and I do all my fine tuning with the brushes generally. The vibrance is perhaps a little bit high. Then I'm going to go into brushes and I'm going to darken the sky a little bit. Pretty much be my first default setting. Then maybe using a new brush, but doing a similar thing, darkening. I'm going to darken some of these shadow areas to emphasize this kind of light dark pattern I was talking about. So areas that are already dark, I'm darkening slightly more, just here, here, along the bottom edge, behind this grass here. I may just try darkening the very bottom edge of the frame here, even though this line is useful for the composition to take our eye into the frame. I'm finding the brightness on this area a little bit distracting. I'm going to use a big soft brush and just knock that down a tiny bit. See, it doesn't take much. It stops it from being an area that attracts your eye, and it becomes part of the more background tones. It's a subtle difference. Let me just show you with and without the masks. So that's before any brushes, and that's with. It's quite small. Now what I need to do now, having pushed back the areas that I think are less important and darkened some of the dark areas, there's one or two bits I'd like to emphasize. I do that with a separate brush, which increases the exposure and the contrast and the clarity. And for most pictures, this will work pretty well. So in particular areas like the bottom right here with these grasses and some grasses here in the darker point and up the path, I'm going to try and lift them, give them a little bit more punch. So we have exposure about +0.5, contrast +13, clarity +28, 30, something like that. And again, a pretty big brush. You see, and as I'm doing this, it's just lifting up these tones. So I do before and after, before, after. It is robbing us of some of the colour. The clarity tool tends to do that, but we could maybe add a little bit in on this brush to compensate for that. Yep, that's working quite well. I'd like maybe a bit more in this tree here. I rather like this diagonal line and the sense of light behind the bushes here. So I'm going to lighten that patch through there and back to the trees on the right. Then this area along the top of the grass here, perhaps a little bit too much. I've undone that. I'm going to redo it. I don't want to hit this area here, which is very bright anyway in the centre. Let me show you what I mean. Yeah, this area here needs no more lightening. It's already pretty bright. And then maybe a line up through the path, just to have this sense of it running up into the frame. That looks pretty good, and let's give it a little vignette for the whole thing. Quite small, and that's it.